Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be taking a look at the new album from Childish Gambino titled Because the Internet. But first, I feel I need to ask you all an uncomfortable question, one I don't think there's an easy answer to, and one I certainly can't properly answer. How much does race matter in music? Particularly in rap music, for instance. Now, on the one hand, music spans skin color and culture, and one would like to think that it shouldn't matter when we're talking about artists and personal taste. I mean, come on, we live in a generation where Jason Aldean can collaborate with Ludacris, and Brad Paisley can collaborate with LL Cool J, and we should be able to judge music regardless of any sort of racial connotations associated with that music. And yet, when we have acts like Eminem or Cage or Yelawolf or Macklemore or the Beastie Boys, the prefix white is always added to their titles as rappers. Why? But you know what? It runs deeper than that, to a bigger cultural question. Whether or not hip-hop or rap holds central or unique roles to black culture, and the distinguishing factors that make that genre unique to that audience. Now, of course, this can reach cartoonish and rather stupid extremes, such as those twits calling Lord racist for attacking shallow luxury rap for its materialism and emptiness. But you know what? One can't exactly deny that there's a distinctive difference between the place of hip-hop and black culture, particularly in the United States, in comparison with other genres with respect to black culture, like country or metal. Now, let me assure you, this isn't solely confined to the hip-hop genre. Many would rightfully make the argument that jazz, soul, funk, disco, R&B, and maybe even the very origins of rock and roll itself could be considered to have deep roles in black culture. And look, nowhere is this difference more apparent than the subgenres of nerd culture topics like sci-fi and fantasy, which has unfortunately tended to trend overwhelmingly white or Asian. Now, there have been acts that have bucked against this trend, like the Afrofuturist movement, for instance, with its most recognizable figure in modern music being Janelle Monáe and all the awesome work that she has done. Seriously, if you're not listening to Janelle Monáe by now, you certainly should be. Now, all of these works suggest a synthesis, a fusion of stereotypically white sci-fi precepts with discussions and critiques of real-world black culture and history. Now, from my point of view, Janelle Monáe is doing something truly great by stripping away any sort of needless racial annotations associated with subgenre conventions like sci-fi or fantasy and adapting them to her own unique viewpoint. She's broadening the spectrum here. So, okay, let's ask another question. What do you get when you have a black rapper who is a nerd, an admitted nerd, and is somewhat enamored with what's stereotypically called white culture to the point where he feels that he has lost something of his black cultural roots? Well, in that case, you get Childish Gambino, well known as Donald Glover, a comedian and actor from NBC's excellent show Community. When he first released his major label debut album, Camp, it polarized critics, mostly because it was an album that spent much of its running time discussing Gambino's unique insecurity, feeling like he was an outcast because he was too black for the white kids and too white for the black kids. His skin was black, and yet he liked comic books and sci-fi and defiantly not the stereotypical tough guy gangster rapper. He never could even remotely hope to fit that role, to the point where his attempts at even rising up to play one to win over girls were just completely unconvincing. Coupled with the Baroque pop-infused production, the near constant stream of pop culture references, and his cartoonish and exaggerated flow, it made for an interesting listen, if not unequivocally great or even wholly good one. Despite Pitchfork's scathing line, "If you only buy one hip-hop album this year, I'm guessing it'll be Camp," a line denigrating the presumably ignorant, read white audiences who followed Glover over from Community, there is something of a grain of truth in that observation. And as a white guy who listens to a fair amount of hip-hop and who is clearly the audience for that album Camp, what did I think of it? Well, look, guys, it was okay. I like the instrumentation and the production, drawing from Baroque pop with Kanye's influences plainly evident, but Gambino's flow was really jerky, the hashtag rap got old really fast, the references were well structured, but they dated themselves very quickly, and Gambino's very real insecurity often lacked coherency and depth to truly be fleshed out and realized, or even remotely discussed on a cogent level. But that being said, I can accept that it might have greater resonance with other audiences who might more closely resemble Gambino's situation. And all the real positives on the album were enough for me to give his newest album, Because the Internet, a listen. Did it manage to work better than its predecessor? Well, In a way, yes. You can tell that Childish Gambino was aiming a fair bit higher with Because the Internet than his previous record. And for the most part, he creates a much starker and much more impressive picture than he did on that record. And let me stress that the best parts of this album are where he takes a run at very deep concepts and comes up with some solid observations surrounding fame, introversion, and dealing with death. But on the other hand, all these observations come on a meandering, messy, frequently unfocused album that exposes the dark edges of a deeply insecure young man who seems to be swiping chunks from Drake's playbook. And ultimately, look, that means I don't quite like Because the Internet as much as I wanted to, which is, I gotta admit, that's disappointing. So, okay. Let's start with the instrumentation and the production, which takes a left turn into dark, reverb, and distorted infused melancholy and never quite leaves there. While there were these clarion moments of classical instrumentation on Camp, this album aims to go darker and grimier, although I can't help but feel it lacks some of that texture to pull it off effectively, which is a follow-up issue from Camp. Now, the instrumentation that's most similar and immediately springs to mind is Drake's, along with the muted R&B edges, but Childish Gambino has aimed for a bit more diversity in his instrumentation, even featuring a guitar solo on the Worst Guys. In fact, if I was going to level an immediate criticism at this album, I'd say it's overloaded with instrumental ideas. Songs frequently switch up the beats or drop the melody out entirely mid-song to replace it with different instrumentation, often multiple times and without warning, leading to a disjointed sound collage that's unfortunately less interesting than it sounds because it ultimately cripples the album's flow and momentum. It also doesn't help matters that the hooks are seriously lacking on this record, leaving tracks just to bleed across each other in effort and instead of actually having any forward momentum. And while I do get this was intentional, it doesn't make the album an easy listen. And like with Drake, the dour melancholy of it all can occasionally get wearisome. Even more so here because the clear thesis of this record doesn't really materialize into the final track. More on this in a bit. And then we've got Childish Gambino himself. You know, I'll grant him this. His flow has improved, and he's a good enough singer to more than handle his choruses. And hell, even his falsetto, it's not bad. It's nothing special, mind, but he does a solid enough job conveying emotion that I'm inclined to give him a pass here. However, there are still traces of annoyances from Camp that only detract from this album. The hard rhyming that doesn't really fit well, the occasional overemphasized flow, and the fact that, like Drake, he's completely unconvincing when he attempts to come across as angry or threatening. Maybe Donald Glover is just too much of a nice guy, I don't know, but I can't say that it doesn't hurt parts of the album where he's expected to go hard, and, you know, I don't buy it for a second. But you know what? Maybe that was the overall point, which takes us straight to lyrics and theme. Now, on a technical level, Childish Gambino continues to show some well-structured rhymes and punchlines that flow together very well. And with the improvements to his overall flow, the presentation is better. However, the pop culture references are back in force, complete with auditory samples from YouTube videos, which I hope were attained legitimately. And while I understand while they're there, look, I never felt that they helped the overall cohesion and general emotion of the album. If anything, the somewhat silly of their presentation, just how out of place and immediately recognizable they were. Seriously, he makes Disney references to The Little Mermaid. It just doesn't work well. It only made things worse and only undercut the deeper, more serious elements that Glover was looking to present. If anything, that was a damn shame because the serious parts on this album are where Childish Gambino, he's at his absolute best. The entire album puts on display the internal dichotomy between his introverted insecurities and his desires to rise to fame and prominence and success as a rapper. And like Drake before him, the question of does it all really matter comes up early and frequently, along with the questions of whether or not fame was all worth it in the end. Unlike Camp's descriptions of sexual antics and racial insecurities, although the latter does occasionally come up, we'll come back to this, Because the Internet is more concerned with fleeting romances and contemplating the specter of death. So much so that the moments where Childish Gambino tries to brag just feel jarringly out of place. Sure, now, the wordplay is good, but when so much of the album shows his obvious distaste for the thugging and empty partying, which is a bit of insight I did appreciate, you have to wonder if the only reason that these tracks are on the album in the first place is to give this record some form of forward momentum. Nevertheless, I will give Childish Gambino some credit for pulling off some surprisingly strong verses, either sung or rapped, where he contemplates his mortality on a deeply personal level. Artistic legacy is barely even mentioned. This is more focused on a man dealing with the fact that we're all on Earth for a pitifully short time and we need to make something of it, and even if we do or don't, the Earth ultimately won't care in the end. And to that end, The biggest net positive that Childish Gambino integrates into this album is the running metaphor of the internet, both to highlight the shallowness of fame and hunting for it online in tracks like World Star, and the eternal nature of the web on Earth, the oldest computer, last night. Not only does the internet provide a universal medium to communicate, it's also an uncaring entity that preserves the most banal histories, say, like all our lives in the grand scope of things. And considering how much of this album is centered around Gambino just wanting to be left alone and not having to bother with the shallow trivialities of the hip-hop game, and yet constantly being drawn back in by friends and relationships, you know what, the internet metaphor becomes all the more stronger and all the more potent and all the more, well, effective. So, okay, with everything that I've already described, most of you are probably wondering why I don't dig the hell out of this album. There were some really meaty themes that I found interesting to really think through and give it some good thought. So why isn't Because the Internet really resonating with me? Well, it's a really messy album instrumentally, but it's much the same lyrically as well. I've already mentioned that the thug brag rap just feels out of place and completely unconvincing, but I also like to throw some of the romance tracks into that category too. Now look, don't get me wrong, I understand why they're there as the tenuous anchors that draw Childish Gambino back into a society he would rather prefer to avoid to become more of a recluse. But songs like Pink Toes and Shadows, they just feel out of place on the album as a whole, as do the questionable references to privilege and isolation from black culture, holdovers from camp that, you know what, they don't quite fit into this album. And on that note, this record can't help but feel a little bit unfocused and the ending rather lacking, mostly because it feels like we're only getting the broad brushstrokes of the story, the emotional stakes without the deeper insight or proper resolution. It feels like we're getting part one, and that there might be a part two coming up later is something I would hope for. And look, one that's compelling to watch Childish Gambino expose his deeper insecurities and coping methods to deal with death. Anything deeper only begins to come up together on the final track, and look, even that track feels unfocused, basically like wandering off at the very end with questions of please help me. And you begin to realize whether or not Childish Gambino even has a cogent resolution to this entire album formula. Ugh. Look, I like the ideas that this album is exploring, and Childish Gambino's raw, hold nothing back, insecure presentation is certainly more preferable to Drake's arrogance, but look, the presentation is messier, and the lyrics aren't quite cutting or sharp enough to justify it. There are too many points in this album that needed sharper moments that went a little bit deeper to truly strike a chord with me. And let's be honest, Childish Gambino only really scratched the surface on this album. It's the same problem that he ran into with Camp. And while this album is an improvement over that predecessor, I can't help but feel that Childish Gambino still hasn't found a presentation style that actually truly works for his half comedic, half deeply personal form of delivery. And look, because the internet, it just doesn't quite get there. All that being said, this album is very frequently beautiful, and while it might lack that deeper dimension, I'm not one to deny that there are some compelling pictures painted there that did truly find some level of emotional resonance with me. So with that, it's a 7 out of 10, and it's a tentative recommendation for me. This album is not an easy listen. If you don't have patience, you won't like it. With its freeform style, rapid shifts in tone, occasionally obtuse lyrics, and often painfully revealing material. And honestly, I can't say that all of you will like it. But trust in this, because because the internet isn't a great album, Childish Gambino still succeeded in making an interesting album and one that's worth talking about. And you know what? I'll take that over boredom any day of the week. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at before the end of the year, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.